Let's start with the front page of the Evening Standard on today's show. Dead in a ditch, says the headline. Brexit delayed, I should say, to January the 31st. Gillian, Boris Johnson pledged we'd leave on Thursday. We're now not going to do that. Will he pay a price with the voters?
I don't think so. I think it's clear to the voters that he's tried absolutely everything. He's gone back, he's got a new agreement. Everybody said that couldn't happen. He's brought the new agreement back to Parliament. He's got it through the second reading of Parliament. He's now going to try again today.
He said he'd die in a ditch.
I don't think anyone actually thought he would die in a ditch, but I think that figuratively what he was saying is he would do absolutely everything possible to meet that deadline. What's now happened is he's got a new deal. We now hopefully need to bring that deal back again today, and I hope that they vote for it, because we need to actually start to go through the process of scrutinising that bill, in my opinion.
Right. What do you think will happen in terms of the voters?
Well, I mean, look, from the point of view of Labour Party activists and members, they're well up for a general election. I mean, you know, just talking to PPCs across the country, people out campaigning in their hundreds. I think, though, it's got to be about the right strategy for the party. At the end of the day, we've been very, very clear. We've got to be 100% confident that no deal is not going to happen. And I think that, for me, is the most important thing that overrides everything else.
No deal forever, or no deal till January the 31st?
I think no deal forever, of course. But, I mean, from my point of view, I think there's a lot of political comings and goings from the Lib Dems that are a bit questionable at the moment. I mean, if they're as serious about stopping no deal, rather than just winning more seats in Parliament, I'm not quite sure that they're being genuine in their...
All right, we're going to talk about that in more detail. Let's stick with the initial question, which is that Boris Johnson promised that the UK would leave on Thursday. What does that do in terms of trust with voters?
Well, it's probably another nail in the coffin of trust from the voters with politicians in general, I think. But, I mean, my feeling is there's already immense cynicism about what a gulf there is between Parliament and the electorate, in terms of there's a referendum, there's a result. We're still not out after 3 years. The extensions keep happening. Politicians are now saying, well, we don't want an election, so we don't want to be answerable to the electorate. So, I mean, where does that leave voters? How can voters have a voice? What can voters do about any of this? It feels like politicians of all parties and all stripes are just keen to widen the gulf between the ordinary people and the people in Parliament.
Well, carrying on from that, Jonathan, do you think there will be a price to pay for Boris Johnson having gone back on his word?
I think the initial argument that he stretched every sinew and tried to get it would have protected him, but I think he made that difficult for himself by pulling the bill, because that would have enabled him to say, look, I've done everything, but actually people can look at that and say, well, no, you didn't. You didn't even give those last few days up to the 31st to try and pass your bill. That looked like game playing. I think he was a new Prime Minister who came in with this die in the ditch, do or die mandate, and people, despite their basic distrust of politics, were ready to give him a chance. He has failed on that, and not only because of sabotage from his opponents, through his own decision to yank the bill just because he didn't get his way on the timetable. I don't think that will go down well with his own voters, and it gives an opening to Nigel Farage and the Brexit Party to say he didn't do everything, he didn't all but die in a ditch, he actually sabotaged it himself.
Gillian?
Well, actually, I would partially agree. I wanted to bring the bill back straight away. To me, there's only two routes. You talked about stopping no deal. Really the best way to stop no deal has always been to get a deal. This is the second deal we've now had with the European Union. It's actually just a deal to get to first base, to start the negotiations for the future arrangements. And I think it's a reasonable approach. As actually I voted for the previous one, I thought that was a reasonable approach. I personally think we ought to force Parliament to go through the stages of that bill. That would be my preference.
Was it a mistake to pull it in the way
I was surprised, actually, when I heard it. I wasn't sure why we just didn't... You know, the whole point was we didn't have enough time. Well, we've used almost as much time not having the time now.
Or was it petulant? Was it petulant and childish not to have tried to pursue, having got a victory, finally, in Parliament in terms of second reading? Was it petulant to pull it?
I personally would have gone ahead with it. And I don't know what the reason was, but I think there is a lot of distrust in Parliament. And what there was, you know, this majority of 30, the question is how many people are just basically playing the game to say, I voted once
But that's
for
fine,
Brexit.
but if you're Boris Johnson, then expose that. Try to pass it right up to the last moment, you know, midnight on the 30th sort of thing, and show everyone, look, I couldn't get it through. Instead, he's given people the chance to say, it's your fault.
Right, well, we're going to talk about a general election election, and welcome in Vicky Young, the BBC's chief political correspondent. We know, Vicky, that the government wants a general election. What are they actually doing today to try and get one?
Well, they're going to, under the Fixed Term Parliament Act, bring forward a vote. Now, I think we talked about this last week and said that, you know, 2/3 of MPs would have to back it. That's 434 MPs. So obviously that will need Labour to come on side for that to get through. So that would be for an election on the 12th of December. And at the moment, unless Labour change their mind, it's looking pretty unlikely. That vote, we think, will happen about 6:30, 7 o'clock this evening. And then the big question is, what does the government do if it doesn't get it through? There is an alternative on the table, which is coming from the SNP and the Liberal Democrats. And this is a simple bill, not quite a one-line bill, but a simple bill, just saying we want an election on the 9th of December. And, of course, this is causing a lot of chat because they are being accused, the SNP and the Liberal Democrats, of abandoning their push for a second referendum, something, of course, they would completely dispute. And lots of people saying, well, look, you know, the Lib Dems and the SNP think they would do quite well in an election. That's why they're willing to go for it. If you're a Labour MP, a lot of them are looking at the polls and thinking we might not do so well, so they might resist it. So I think, you know, the big question there is if the government fails, as we think they will tonight, to get it through, would they be willing, would Boris Johnson be willing to get behind this other alternative and push it through as the government?
Right. We haven't heard from Labour this morning ourselves, and they didn't want to come onto the programme today to discuss what they are thinking with regard to the next steps. What are you hearing from them? Because there are splits at the very top.
Yeah, now the Shadow Cabinet is meeting right now to decide what they do on all of this, and I mean that could take quite some time. There are some who think, yeah, let's go for a general election. You know, Sam says he's up for it. There are some who do think, look, you know, put your faith in Jeremy Corbyn. Everyone wrote him off last time round. He did much better than expected. He's a good campaigner. Get out there and let's just get behind this because an election is inevitable at some point in the next 6 months. But there are others saying, now, hang on a minute, that's not a good route to go down. You're doing it all on Boris Johnson's terms. And their argument is we've got to make sure that no deal is off the table before we go into this. Now, of course, that extension being granted today till the end of January, some would say, well, there you go, you've got that. Slightly, some would say they're changing and moving the goalposts here because they're now looking at the end of the transition period, a couple of years ahead, saying we don't know what might happen then. I mean, I think the danger for Labour is it looks like they're making excuses. To take no deal off the table, there are two ways to do it, as we were discussing. There's to get a deal or to revoke Article 50. But to get a deal that Labour might back, they need to be in power. So you could argue you need to go for the general election, win the general election, and by not going for it, you are admitting that you're not certain that you could win that general election.
Is this the end of the Rebel Alliance?
That is a good question. I mean, the problem there, I think, when it comes to a general election, you know, they're just not on the same page here. It's completely split. You look at those former Conservatives. If you're a former Conservative who has lost the whip and no hope of getting it back, if you vote for an election, you know, you're out of your job, your career's finished, isn't it, by the 9th or 12th of December. There are another group, of course, in the former Tories who want to get back in. I think some of them would vote for a general election. And then you've got, of course, you know, people's vote, second referendum. Is that dream dead? I think that is another really interesting argument. And did Labour decide? One Labour person said to me today, look, if you're not going to go for a general election, you have to be clear about what the alternative is. So if you're going to vote against this today, what are you saying? You're either going to go with the Liberal Democrats and the SNP for an alternative, or do you say, no, we're fully getting behind another referendum? You need to have something to fill that vacuum. Otherwise, it just looks like Labour are bystanders in this argument.
Vicky, thank you very much. Let's talk to Drew Hendry from the SNP. Drew, are you going to vote for an election today?
No, we won't be voting to allow Boris Johnson to set the agenda here. It's clear that what he wants to do is get his own way with this, and it's not the right thing to do. We want to stop his deal. That's why we brought forward the proposal for the 9th, and we want to make sure that this can go back to the people now that an extension to Article 50 has been agreed.
Right, so you're not going to vote for his general election, you're going to vote for one 3 days earlier?
Indeed, yeah.
Right, well, I mean, people will wonder what on earth is the difference between having a general election on the 12th or the 9th?
Well, it's very simple. Having a general election on the 9th means that we can stop this dreadful Brexit deal that Boris Johnson has brought forward. It singles Scotland out for particularly raw treatment, and doing it on the 9th means that that date is fixed. It can't be manipulated, and neither can that Brexit bill. It also puts the ball into Labour's court now. It seems increasingly the case that they want this Brexit deal to go through, and they've already allowed 19 of their Labour MPs to support this deal. They need to decide whether or not they're a Remain or a Leave party, but it looks like they want Brexit to happen.
Right, do you agree that the Rebel Alliance is dead, Sam?
The Alliance might well be dead, but I definitely don't agree with that about the sort of Remain party position. Look, Labour's been very difficult. We will lose seats if we didn't allow some of those 19 MPs to vote the way they did, even if they were whipped against. That's a fact. Some of those seats are 70%, for Brexit. But, the difficulty is that, Labour's been trying to ride these two horses, and I think we have now clearly taken a position, and that position is to say that the best way forward for all of this, if we're not able to get a general election, is obviously to have a referendum on, ideally, Labour's deal. And my personal position is that we need a referendum to lance the boil, because I think at the moment there's clearly not a majority in Parliament for a clear pathway forward, and I think it's only right that that deal is put back to the country for people to say yes or no, do you want to continue down this pathway? Because at the moment it seems to me that what's on the table is not better than staying in the European Union.
Right, but Jonathan, Labour and Jeremy Corbyn have repeatedly said we want a general election. As soon as a Brexit extension is secured, which it has been until the 31st of January, bring on the election. Except now we're hearing from Sam that actually they need a referendum first.
I think this is the problem for them. I think there was some clarity about that position before, which said, we're going to hold off on election until we're absolutely sure you've got this extension. Now that it's there, it's very hard to now create a new reason. And, I'm sympathetic to the idea of doing anything to stop no deal. But once you've painted yourself into that corner of saying we're gagging for an election, just make sure you get your extension from the EU, very hard to change the story again. And you were saying something about the position being very clear to just have a referendum. Unfortunately, it's not as clear as you've articulated it, because the position is we've got to get a Labour deal first. They're not saying let's put Boris Johnson's terrible deal to a referendum. They're saying we'll get into government, then we'll negotiate a different deal, then we'll have a referendum, and we're not even sure whether we're going to support Remain or the deal we've negotiated. So the one thing you can't claim for Labour is clarity on Brexit. They haven't got that. And what's happening now a bit, you asked about Rebel Alliance, is finally Brexit as an issue is sort of giving way to party interest, and that was always going to happen at some point. But I do think the Lib Dems, if they're going for it, they're being very opportunistic. I don't think they can claim a big principled moral high ground position. They have looked at the polls and think now's our moment, let's go for it. And so that previous unanimity around no deal is cracking apart, I think.
Right, Drew, you're being opportunistic along with the Lib Dems.
No, we're being very consistent. We've said all along that this needs to go back to the public. There is no arithmetic in the House of Commons for people's vote at the moment, so we need to break that deadlock. We've said as soon as an extension was in place, we'd look to have a general election to kick Boris Johnson and his Tory government out of power, the government which is particularly bad for Scotland and has singled Scotland out for raw treatment. The fact is that this has to go back to the people. It's up to Labour to explain how they would put together a people's vote within the deadline of the 31st of January. I can't see how that could possibly happen. Of course, if people's vote opportunity comes forward, we will, as we've done in the past, support it. But in the meantime, this is the only way to stop this deal and stop Brexit and get it back to the people.
I mean, surely Jeremy Corbyn and Labour have to now say yes to a general election. They've got that extension secured till the 31st of January. You win a general election and you stop no deal.
I mean, look, the pressure from Labour grassroots for a general election is massive. Party members want it. They're out in their hundreds and marshal seats all across the country. The Tories can't put hardly any boots on the floor anywhere. I think Jeremy himself is up for a general election, actually.
So who's stopping him?
Well, at the end of the day, we're a collective party. It's not just his decision. We've got to work out what's best in terms of, exactly as the SNP is saying, is, can we stop this mess of a Brexit going through?
Right, there is the opportunity, of course, if this one-line bill, as it's being called by the Lib Dems and the SNP, is put down once the government is defeated, which is what most people assume, because they won't get a two-thirds majority. Ministers yesterday called it a stunt, but now there is a sense that maybe you could go for it. Would you vote in favour of it, Gillian?
Now, what I don't like about it is it doesn't actually have a deal. Again, we've only got two outcomes here, a deal or revoke. There's only two actual end games, and that one takes a deal off the table. This deal out of being discussed in Parliament. It's clear the people's vote actually is splintering now, both within the organisation and actually within the parties, because clearly Jo Swinson or Ian Blackford are not going to be the next Prime Minister of this country. So what they will do is they will not be assuring the people's vote people that they will be able to get a second referendum. That will, all they'll get is some extra seats for themselves. It will not be enough to secure a second referendum. And therefore, what they're saying is, OK, we're going to go off and act in our own interest at this point. And the last time Labour were clear with it, I'm sorry to say, was actually in their 2017 manifesto pledge, when they said, we will agree to respect the result of the referendum. And since then, they've done almost everything to turn contortions to try and stop doing that, apart from a very small number who do represent Leave seats and have been brave enough to vote for a deal. And this is why, ultimately, we may have to just have a general election, even though it's not the right time of year and it's a terrible thing to do, because clearly we don't have the numbers in Parliament to do anything. You know, and I hoped that we could pass a withdrawal bill, because I think that would be the best. I think it's abdicating our duty to push all this back on an already divided country. We should be solving this, and it would sadden me if we couldn't.
Drew?
Well, I think this is an awful deal. I think it's exactly right that we do everything we can to stop it. As I said, it singles Scotland out, particularly for a raw deal. We've seen England and Wales, who voted to leave, getting an option there for the deal, and the Northern Ireland, who voted to remain, getting ostensibly to remain in the single market and the customs union, and Scotland uniquely being dragged out despite the fact that 62% of the electorate voted to remain. It sets us up for an economic disadvantage and a social disadvantage too. So we'll do everything in our power to stop that. That's why we're putting forward this bill to see a general election and kick Boris Johnson and the Tories out of power. It's up to Labour now to decide if they're going to allow this Brexit to happen and this horrible deal to go through, or if they're going to take a stand and become a party of Remain and make it clear what they're doing in the general election.
Well, what are you going to do, Sam?
Well, the Shadow Cabinet's meeting at the moment, so we'll probably find out by the end of the programme, I'm assuming.
Would you like them to decide?
I think that the pressure from activists for a general election is huge at the moment. People really do want to go out and fight and win a general election.
All right. I'm going to show you something from Laura Kunsberg, which is a tweet that she's put out, the BBC's political editor. Government is likely to table a similar bill to the one we've been talking about from the Lib Dems and SNP tomorrow if they fail to get an election tonight. The Number 10 source says they will introduce a bill almost identical to the Lib Dem SNP bill, and we will have a pre-Christmas election anyway. Gillian?
It is certainly looking like if we can't get that bill through, we will have to have an election. I mean, they're the only two options. Now, we're not going to revoke Article 50. We are the government, and we're not going to do that. So, I mean, Jo Swinson may if she gets to be Prime Minister, which I doubt will happen.
Right. Well, Drew, will you vote for this? If the government's going to put down something similar, you're going to get your way.
Well, clearly, you know, the track record shows so far that you cannot trust Boris Johnson one iota, and I would suspect that the devil here will be very much in the detail of what they're bringing forward. If the 9th of December is OK for them, then they should support the bill that we're putting forward. But of course, I'll be interested to see what the trapdoor, what the catch is that they're going to bring forward tomorrow. I suspect very much that there'll be something there that is totally unpalatable.
But you haven't seen it yet, so you don't actually know. I mean,
I just said I suspect very much that's the case.
Listening to that, you know, support my bill for a general election because I won't support yours. It might have something in it I don't like.
But we don't know yet.
No, well, I accept that, but that is the sort of argument being put forward, not just by you, Drew, but by the other side as well. I mean, how much is this all game playing to you?
I think if you look at the recent opinion polls of what the general public thinks, there's a very large majority of the general public to have a general election, because if you look from outside to Westminster, it's all game playing. Nothing is actually happening. Nothing is being decided. The only thing people can do is block each other. It's like one of those really annoying games of noughts and crosses where both teams are blocking the other one so nobody can get 3 noughts or crosses in a row. The opinion polls also show the majority of the general public go, look, we want to respect the result of the referendum and get on with it and do it because that's democracy. And that includes a lot of people who voted Remain but go, you know, in the future, I would rather live in a country where my vote counts for something that is outside the EU than still be in the EU, which would be my personal preference. This is them, not me. But in the EU, but my vote doesn't count for anything. And I think it's rather sad, really, that a lot of the general public can see that so clearly, and people inside Westminster are so caught up with, can we get a few more seats here, can we do that, can we stop that, and can we make this person look bad? Whereas so many people outside Westminster go, look, the basic rule of democracy is you vote and you accept the result, because otherwise, where are we?
I mean, John Curtis, the polling guru, has a piece up today saying that there are numbers in the sort of mid-40s for an election, but higher numbers actually for a second referendum. And I think that gets to the point, which is everybody's here talking about we've got to resolve this. I don't think a general election does resolve this.
Or a second referendum, indeed.
A second referendum would be closer because it would be about Brexit. A general election...
Why should anyone respect the result of a second referendum when the result of the first referendum...
I understand, but just on the point about a general election, it is general, and people will be voting on lots of things other than Brexit.
And then you put a government in, and the government has a mandate,
part of the problem
and the government enacts... whatever it is.
And the point is there isn't that great clarity, and that's partly, again, because Labour's position isn't a sort of binary position. You won't have just leave with the Tories or remain with Labour. It's less clear than that, and that's why I worry that the general election, if people are looking to decide this great Brexit dilemma that the country has, which is almost becoming a kind of culture war in the country, I'm not sure a general election is the means to do that.
The right way to do it is in Parliament. Quite clearly, the right way to do it is in Parliament. We should not be abdicating this back to the country and creating more division. But we've now had 3.5 years, and we do not look like we were looking last week like we were closer, but now we're not looking like we're going to actually complete it. That is the right place to do it. Any other way we do it will actually cause mayhem in the country, in my view, whether it's a second referendum or a general election, which will be a proxy.
Referendum, so you undo with a referendum.
It was always a nonsense to expect that it was going to be done very quickly at all, because, you know, as you said, this is actually just a withdrawal agreement. It's not even a future trade agreement. Whether we get this in or it doesn't happen, we're going to be debating this for another sort of 10 years kind of plus. And I think this is the fundamental problem that's undermined democracy, is the fact that, you know, such a binary choice was put to the public. There was so much lies and deceit. And I think that, you know, that has been undermining democracy. We're not Switzerland. We are a parliamentary democracy. And what I've seen and what I've observed is people being quite angry for the first time ever about essentially the lack of actually any kind of written constitution. The fact that the Prime Minister, with a minus, you know, 43, is able to prorogue Parliament. I mean, we've become a kind of joke country. And I think that for me, you know, this has led to a real kind of like deep thinking moment about what is our country actually going to be in the future? Because the kind of xenophobic agenda of Farage and, to be honest, Johnson as well, is going to be really dangerous. And I don't want to be in some sort of situation that's more akin to Hungary. This is Britain, and we've got some fundamental decency.
Gillian, is that where we're ending up with Boris Johnson?
Not at all. I'm glad to see you come with the usual Labour charm and cheer. No, not at all. Our country, there's many great things about our country. What we're talking about is our relationship with Europe going forward. We had a referendum. All campaigns have elements that you would like and not like about them, particularly if you're on an opposing side, and I'm sure we'll see it in the general election. But the reality is that it was the biggest turnout ever. Basically, people turned out. They voted for, you know, probably a lot of it was emotion. I think a lot of voting is emotional. But they did vote overwhelmingly for us to leave. You know, it's quite a clear result. The question then comes back to what Tamara said. I accept that Scotland didn't, but more people voted to leave the European Union in Scotland than voted for the SNP. So still the numbers are there in Scotland, more than voted for the SNP.
Let me just put this to Drew.
I think most Scots are Democrats.
It's a false equivocation, you know that.
Most Scots are Democrats as well.
Well, the Tories are going to guarantee Scotland leaving the Union.
Scots are. Indeed,
Yes, go on, Drew.
Indeed, Scots are Democrats, and what we've seen is that democratic position of 62% of people voting to remain has been ignored. Scotland's government has been ignored when they put forward a compromise proposal to the UK government, and the Scottish Parliament, where every party except the Tories voted against this situation, has been ignored by this Tory government over the past mess of 3.5 years while they've been dealing with this Brexit shambles. It's unacceptable, and it's why many more people now are saying that the option for the future is for Scotland to be an independent country taking its own seat within the EU. And of course we'll be making that point very strongly during any general election that comes forward.
All right, just very briefly, yes or no, Drew, will you be attaching any amendments like votes for 16-year-olds to your bill?
Yeah, well, it's not up to us to attach amendments. The Speaker would decide on which amendments would actually be applicable.
And would you vote for that if it was put forward as an amendment?
We've always said that we want votes for 16s. That's been very consistent. So if the opportunity is there to vote for it, we would. But we don't have control over amendments going to the Parliament, that would be down to the Speaker of the House of Commons.
All right, Drew Hendry, thank you very much for joining us. Let me just show you this story from Sky News. Data protection experts want Watchdog to investigate Conservative and Labour parties. Manuals leaked to Sky News show both major parties use Experian to target voters. That's the credit rating agency, despite no option to opt in or out. How new is this, Tamandra?
I'm afraid it's not new at all. I mean, it's a credit to Sky for doing the investigation and showing the details, but when I read a book on big data in 2015 that came out 2016, and it was absolutely standard practice for all political parties to combine commercially available data sets from consumer data with other available data and profile voters and try and target voters with messages that would appeal to them individually. It's been absolutely standard political campaigning since certainly Barack Obama's first successful election campaign. And I have a degree of cynicism when more recently people have said, well, this is a terrible thing, this individual targeting of voters and this losing of an overall political message, which it is. But a lot of people only got bothered about this more recently when there were some results they didn't like. Whereas when Barack Obama did it, everyone was, oh, isn't this marvellous, modern campaigning? He's so down with the kids.
Do you think that's the case?
No, I think what people didn't like, if you think about the Cambridge Analytica affair exposed by my colleague Carol Cadwalladr at the Observer. No, what the point though was that people were giving away their data inadvertently. They were sort of lured in to various messages that appeared to be about polar bears and about win 50 million quid if you can predict the results of the European Football Championships, and suddenly they were giving their data over to political campaigns.
But is that new, Jonathan?
But it's not new. It's not new at all. I mean, I'm really glad that people woke up and went, hang on, what? So when I fill in a survey about my favourite kind of cheese, this is all going to build a massive profile of me in somebody's database that's going to be used not only to sell me cheese, but also to sell me political policies. I think it's a terrible thing that our data is hoovered up without really asking us, that we're profiled, that things are targeted to our profiles, instead of having a proper in the open political debate. I think it's a terrible thing, but it really annoys me that a lot of people thought this was marvellous as long as the right people were winning, and when they didn't like the result of the votes, suddenly it's like, oh, I've just discovered this awful thing. Like,
Look,
well,
I mean, the stuff in the
nice
US was particularly problematic because, for example, the now Trump administration and the people involved in Cambridge Analytica were doing things like deliberately targeting black and minority communities to suppress votes. I find that fundamentally undemocratic.
It is undemocratic. It is undemocratic.
Well, surely then we need to agree that we need proper regulation.
It's always been a terrible thing.
But these are both parties being accused of using this information in the way that Tamandra has set out.
It's not a new thing. I've ran campaigns in the last 4 elections using data. I mean, it's not exactly a secret that this is that parties gather information. I mean, the Labour Party isn't at an advantage to the Tories because we can put literally hundreds of thousands of people on the streets knocking doors
Not sure
in
they
a mass.
convince voters, though.
But I mean, in terms of gathering the data, they're actually knocking those doors to ask questions.
Do you tell the people when you knock
that.
the doors? Do you say to people, we're going to take this data and put it into a profile of you that we hold in our data banks combined with Experian's data?
I think that we're honest with people saying that we are.
Do you?
I actually don't know. No.
Well, maybe you should. I mean, this is the thing. All parties can point the finger at other parties and go, well, this is a terrible campaign. Because Labour's system has been in place
for so many years.
But all
it's
the
not
parties
just
are
about using Experian. We've got literally a decade of data from knocking on doors and saying to people, how do you vote?
But just finally on that, the problem is people are suspicious of the motives behind it. I mean, it may not be new, but that is an issue.
That's right. I mean, I think it's the lack of transparency you just exposed where people don't know that this is happening. Even if people who are insiders in this have been doing it for years, I don't think voters did know. No. They were shocked when those revelations I referred to came out, whether they should have known it more or not. It's the lack of transparency. There's something different about telling somebody with a clipboard your name and address to being sort of duped into it when you think you're filling in a competition where there's no mention of politics. I think that is different from someone with a rosette turning up at your doorstep saying, can I have your name and email address?
All right.
And so that's the differences in transparency.
Let's have a look at this. It has just come to us. This is a written statement from the Prime Minister. The government has tabled a motion proposing that an early general election be held. The motion is in the terms set out of the Fixed Terms Parliaments Act of 2011. And it says at the end, and I will recommend to the Queen that the first meeting of the new Parliament takes place before the 23rd of December. That would be for a poll, of course, on the 12th, and then the new Parliament meeting before Christmas. You're smiling. You're looking forward to it, are you?
We just can't get enough of each other, clearly. I mean, if we're not weekends, then it's obviously we miss all the recesses, and now we're going to miss Christmas. We do have to get on with this, and all of the positions are disingenuous, actually. really.
Including yours?
No, I think getting the withdrawal agreement, withdrawal bill through is a genuine position. It is a position that's actually the European position as well. They've negotiated something, they've given us a deal. Let's try and get to the next stage.
All right, we're going to move on to something else before we find out the answer to that question or statement. Should robots ever be allowed to make life or death decisions on the battlefield? There's a campaign to ban so-called killer robots, but some countries, including the UK, are refusing to sign up. Here's Greg Dawson.
It's been a staple of science fiction plots for decades.
A device that once has been launched, it will select its own targets and apply violent force.
Robots so powerful, they become a threat to humans.
Is it okay to delegate the decision to take human life to a machine?
But as technology advances, how worried should we be about it finally becoming science fact?
Everything about the Western way of war is designed to make war as unfair as possible.
At the Science Museum in London, an exhibition on autonomous machines, such as driverless cars, charts the progress of modern robotics.
This kind of technology offers us just a tiny glimpse into the future, but as more and more autonomous machines are developed and the more sophisticated they become, it raises the question, who's in charge, man or machine?
Professor Noel Sharkey has worked in artificial intelligence and robotics for 40 years and leads an international campaign against so-called killer robots.
We're just simply trying to get a prohibition on two critical functions, and that is the function to select a target without a human and the function to engage that target, as the military say, kill it without any human supervision. It's just against human dignity to have a machine make the decision to kill a human.
Give us an idea then of what is out there and what is being developed.
In the United States, who's most far ahead really, they've got fighter jets that can take off and land on aircraft carriers. They've been developing the X-47B. They have submarines that will hunt other submarines, and they have a huge ship, the Sea Hunter, that will go with the flotilla of these submarines, but they could be used to sink other ships as well. Kalashnikov have developed they're the first people to admit they've actually used neural computing, neural network learning to develop an autonomous gun.
To date, 28 countries, several charities and the European Parliament have backed calls for a ban on lethal autonomous weapons. But at the UN, some countries, including the US and Russia, have resisted the calls. The UK also doesn't support an international ban, claiming it would be preemptive as there's still no international agreement on the characteristics of the weapon systems. The MOD says it has no intention of developing fully autonomous weapon systems, but it is trialling AI equipment with human control.
I think if countries want to be part of whatever eventual convention comes out and is agreed upon on how these things are to be used in what context, they're going to have to show that they can, at least technologically speaking, play in the game. It's probably quite instructive to look at the case of, for example, Germany or Japan with nuclear weapons. They've consistently been at the forefront of disarmament, and they've been almost uniformly ignored by the powers that do possess nuclear weapons.
How to use AI doesn't just pose a dilemma for nation states, but also technology firms. Last year, Google was criticised after it was revealed it was working on a project for the US military using AI software that could improve the precision of military drones. In her first TV interview, an employee who quit the company over the project tells us of her fears.
Well, it's for this thing called Project Maven, so that we can run workloads with classified data. And Project Maven is this military drone object recognition program. And this sort of instantly set off alarm bells to me. There's this military concept of the kill chain, and absolutely Maven is part of that chain. I believe I had stayed at Google, and they had gone on to the phase of the project where they wished to run it on Google's cloud infrastructure. And if I had facilitated that, yes, I believe I would be part of that problem. A lot of people hear the words campaign to stop killer robots and they say, oh well, you know, these crazy people, they're worried that Skynet is going to happen and take over and the machines are going to rise up. It's exactly the opposite problem. Actually, I worry that technology is terrible. It's such a hard technological problem to build weapons that can act predictably in these situations. I don't believe that anybody can do it.
Tamandra, can it ever be right to subcontract life and death decisions to machines?
No, I mean, I think it's very important that we recognise one difference between us and machines is that we have moral autonomy and are answerable for our decisions, and we have a conscience, and machines by definition don't. But I think the idea that a killer robot is somehow completely different misunderstands what happens in warfare. We already have a lot of AI and data involved in things like targeting. We already have weapons that kill you from 30,000 feet, operated from thousands of miles away from a container. So, I mean, you know, I have this romantic idea, somebody's going to kill me, I want them to have to look me in the eye and live with that for the rest of their lives. But nobody gets killed like that in warfare these days. It is already remote and highly developed countries using vastly more powerful weapons against often opponents who, I mean, you know, we're going to talk about al Baghdadi. He blew himself up with several children. So we're already talking about warfare as an inhuman act. So I think the fact that we're a bit worried about killer robots says more about us and the way we ourselves maybe doubt our ability to make those moral decisions.
Yeah, I mean, it is remote killing already going on in the battlefield in military operations. So there isn't much of a difference, is there?
Look, I'm someone that came into politics campaigning against the Iraq War, literally outside Mike Gapes' office in Ilford in the early 2000s. And for me, I think this is a jump forward into really kind of a moral quagmire, because it seems to me that it's not just about kind of, you know, guided missiles that are controlled by a pilot sat in a room somewhere. This is actually saying that we may, at some point in the near future, outline a situation where because of machine learning or AI, a decision to kill another human being is actually taken. And that is extremely dangerous territory to be in. I mean, how far do we go along that kind of pathway? I mean, it seems to me that the kind of growing kind of move towards, you know, even faster industrialisation of warfare all across the globe, it just means that often it's people in the global south getting slaughtered and people here saying, well, we're not going to put British soldiers at risk, but yet we're able to go and murder people across the world.
Is it a leap forward, Jonathan?
It is, for that reason, which is that obviously all this stuff has been automated, incredibly high-tech before, but there was, even if it was somebody who was in effect like at the controls of a video game, there was a human being there in, you know, in CENTCOM in Florida or whatever, even if it was far in Iraq, and a lot of us were appalled just by that prospect. But this is obviously worse, to outsource, to contract out that ultimate moral decision. Probably this, I think, alerts us to the fact that AI is already assisting, in the sense that the person at the controls knows which target has been suggested by a machine, but that final decision must be a human decision. What's interesting, though, just slightly, is that where it comes from is actually a function of people who were with Sam in those anti-war demonstrations. Publics around the world do not want to risk their own people anymore. So the technology is devoted to governments wanting to make sure their own military personnel are not in harm's way. And that's partly what's led us to this degree of automation.
Is it stoppable, though, or is it inevitable?
I don't think it's inevitable. I think you do always have to have a human being who can take that responsibility for making these decisions. And I think if you look at the MOD and some of, I mean, they've been putting lots of doctrines, joint publications out around this on how this works at an operational level. From my understanding, I'm not a deep expert on this, but from my understanding, there is always in that chain of command a human being that is involved in making those military decisions. I can't see that stopping soon, personally, because you need to have that accountability. We have that structured command structure today, and yes, okay, how warfare is being enacted is changed massively, but actually the accountability, I think, ought to still be with those military commanders.
But I think the thing is, we already have a degree of human decision making at every level, but and you're right, we already have things like AI and data. I mean, the American general once said, oh, well, you know, people were saying, oh, you shouldn't worry about your metadata, like the things on your phone that say who you call and what time, because your data, the actual content, is safe. And the general said, well, we kill people based on metadata because we can target people thousands of miles away by tracking their communications. So it's already a combination of human judgment and using technology to narrow down targets.
Enhanced intelligence.
But the question is always, who is setting the parameters? I mean, who decided that we should go and impose democracy on Iraq? And look where that has got us today. It's the decision to go to war. It's the decision of going to war and the goals of war and the framework of that. That's what matters. It's those are the human decisions. And in a sense, I think the idea that you would have an individual robot on the battlefield that would make a decision who to shoot is is a detail.
But it's also the vast asymmetry of war, whether it be Russia, whether it be the US, you know, they have the, or China for that matter, that have the money and the technology. You know, the people often dying at the other end of the receipt of this technology, even if it's technology we've sold to other countries, whether it's the Saudis or the Turks or whoever, you know, that's the problem, isn't it? We're giving something which enables, you know, the asymmetry to be so severe that the people on the other side have no chance. It's not a fair fight, is it? And so people are just dying in their hundreds and thousands because of this.
Right, well, let's, it's a good point, actually, to show you and our viewers this photo here of the President of the United States and the Vice President sitting next to him, Donald Trump and his key advisors. They were watching the attack on Abu Bakr al Baghdadi's hideout in northwestern Syria. He was the leader of Islamic State. This has been put out by the White House on social media, and Donald Trump has talked about it. He blew himself up in the end, al-Baghdadi, as the US operation was underway. Does this make the world a safer place, Jonathan?
Not as much as I think Donald Trump would like to say it is. ISIS was not in a kind of one of these top-down organisations where you just decapitate the top man and suddenly the organisation's gone away. Its model was always one about inspiring rather than organising these hideous terror attacks. And if anything, this may be a motivating thing for some of those cells around the country that were never directed by, around the world, rather, who were never directed by him anyway. I also worried about just even the way that Trump delivered this performance yesterday, in which he lingered on, you know, the method of Baghdadi's death and, you know, whimpering and dying like a dog, etc. That may well end up being a sort of counterproductive thing in terms of propaganda, where ISIS used that to inspire revenge attacks, that notion of sort of humiliating. And you contrast that with the announcement, for example, since you mentioned Obama before, the announcement Obama made when bin Laden was killed was, for one thing, much more somber, less crowing. He didn't divulge the operational details. It took years for those to come out. And also he did, even if it was lip service, he did say that in the case several years ago, he at least nodded to the scenario of apprehending and arresting bin Laden and said, of course, that wasn't possible in the event, so he was killed. No, there was none of that lip service here. Trump just revelled in the fact that they had killed him in a sort of extra, you know, beyond even the attempt to bring the man to justice. And I just thought some of the florid language was just unbecoming.
Will it help him, though, politically, saying he's obliterated the Islamic State group, whether it's true or not?
Probably in his base, it certainly will. If it may even beyond his base to some degree. I agree with Jonathan. I felt very uncomfortable listening to the way, and I much prefer the Obama style. However, let's not forget that this guy has killed and been responsible for millions of deaths across this world.
And that's all we've got time
to get
for.
rid of him, yeah.
From all of us, bye-bye.